May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts together be acceptable in your sight, O God, our Creator and Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. The parable Jesus tells in today's gospel lesson, as you heard, is framed by a little story about a couple of brothers who couldn't agree about their inheritance. One of the brothers came to Jesus asking for help in figuring out what to do. "Teacher, bid my brother to divide the inheritance with me." You know, that's really a common enough story in our time as well. It tears us up to see how families can be divided forever because of such disputes. We never do find out the details of these two brothers in this story, but it's merely a framing device for the parable, which has the real message for us. So this brother, anyways, asks Jesus to act as a judge in this dispute, and it seemed like a wise choice. Who could have arbitrated with greater justice than Jesus? Still, there was something wrong in this. Jesus could tell that the brothers' motives perhaps weren't the best, and he answered, "Take heed and beware of all kinds of greed, for a person's life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions." And then Jesus told the worried brother a little story to help him see things a bit more clearly. He told of a wealthy landowner whose problem was that he had more stuff than his soul could absorb. This man probably worked hard for long hours, we imagine. He managed things well, he took good care of things, but something was wrong inside. Somehow, in his concern for success, he forgot the meaning of life. He confused ownership with stewardship, possibly, or he confused possessions with security, savings with safety. He seemed to think that he had finally and was finally able to keep all those bad things at bay with his success, and he lost it all. It is a comfortable feeling to, have enough money to pay the bills, to buy the things we want, to make investments. It helps many, many people to feel safe and secure. And in an insecure world, it's a place where some people try to find some security, a place of safety where their anxiety can end. In a careless moment, his heart mused, "Soul, you have now ample goods laid up for many years. So take your ease and eat, drink, and be merry." It sounds like a good security plan, the perfect retirement program, an impregnable safety net. He could stop worrying about things. He had his, safety deposit box full of RSPs and pension plans. The mortgage was paid off and the cottage had been winterized. The kids had graduated university. The new SUV was in the garage. He was safe. However, it turned out to be a different story, didn't it? He was so well off that he didn't seem to feel the need for God anymore on a daily basis, much less the need and support of his community and his neighbors. He felt safe, and nothing could now get at him. Do you remember in a similar context, Jesus once said, "What does it profit a person if he gains the whole world but loses his real self?" On one level, we admire people who do well, but we also need to ask ourselves, what is success? What does it look like? When is enough enough? When do I stop worrying about things, being anxious? How even do I know when I'm happy? What does it mean to be safe and secure? And why? Why, despite all these things, do I still feel an emptiness inside? That ill-defined anxiety, a vague hollow feeling in my stomach. Why am I still afraid, anxious, ill at ease during those sleepless nights? Well, God, as you heard, spoke the last word in Jesus' little story. You foolish fellow, this night your soul is required of you, and all the things that you've slaved and sweated and worried over, whose will they be? That's a point well taken. A couple of years ago, I did some traveling in Egypt, and as part of our time there, we did a week-long small boat cruise up the Nile River. And as most tourists do, we visited the almost hidden, inaccessible Valley of the Kings, where many of the pharaohs had had their tombs built for them. And they were hidden away in this, what at the time was a remote valley, which made it as impossible as they could to find or to enter. For many of them, it is said that it was sometimes even the custom for the pharaoh to entomb the slaves who buried the kings and their treasurers, this to prevent grave robberies and to serve the king in the afterlife. And that whole plan, at least the being hidden part, worked so well for Pharaoh Tutankhamun that the whereabouts of his tomb was concealed for millennia, until the English archaeologist Howard Carter discovered the still intact tomb in 1922, some 3,300 years after the pharaoh's death. I went to Cairo as well, and I went to the National Museum there and saw the Treasures of King Tut exhibit. And the wealth of it all was staggering, really staggering. Yet the king himself, surrounded by all this stuff that had no meaning to him anymore, was just as dead as the poorest slave beside him. When I was a child, I used to love to read comic books. The superhero ones were my first choice, the Superman and Batman and Spider-Man and the like. But sometimes when I had read them all, I would go to my cousin's place, and she had a different kind of comic book. She had the Archies and the Casper the Friendly Ghost and the Mickey and the Donald comics, and I would read them there. Anyway, I remember the Donald Duck family very well, among others. And Donald has his girlfriend, Daisy, his 3 nephews, Huey, Louie, and Dewey, and he also had an uncle, Scrooge McDuck, whom I often think of when I hear Jesus' little story about the rich man who wanted to store his great wealth for the future. You may remember Uncle Scrooge McDuck. He was a legendary miser, his name even reflecting that, Scrooge, and this Scottish variant of the family branch. Uncle Scrooge was very rich. He dressed like that, that Wall Street tycoon in the old Monopoly game. Although true to the Duck family tradition, he never wore any pants either. But there would often be pictures of Scrooge McDuck taking recreation in one of his huge storerooms, swimming and diving in the great piles of gold coins that filled them. he would be backstroking and diving into and rolling around in all his fabulous money. And it made him feel on top of the world, successful, impregnable, secure, Scrooge McDuck. There would often be a picture in a panel in the book of his head and his upper body away under the surface of all his money, with just his bare little duck bum sticking out, tail feathers wiggling in sheer blissful pleasure. There's a sense, I think, in which all of the parables, and this one in particular, invites us to do that same thing with this little story. We need, as we need to do with all of the parables Jesus tells, to stick our head under the surface of the story, to dive down into it, take a look around, to really appreciate what they mean, to understand their depth of meaning. That's our job with the parables. Whether in the doing we wriggle our backsides in pleasure or not, I leave up to you. But Jesus is talking about wealth here, about possessions, about having more than we need, about having enough of something yet still craving more of it. I'm a little bit like that with cheese. But when we stick our head beneath the surface of this story and look around, when we swim in it and look around, we can see that he was also talking about so much more than just wealth, although he was talking about that. In this parable, when we look deeper, when we dive in, we can see that this story is about all of those things we cling to that give us a false sense of security. All those things that we create that make us feel safe. All those things that we clutch to ourselves to help us ignore the fact that human life is very fragile. That we are needy, dependent, and contingent creatures, that only one heartbeat, one breath, one clogged artery, one speeding bus away from who knows what. The subtext of Jesus' story today asks us, where do you find your sense of security? Where is your hope? Where do you look for meaning and comfort and help? This is really a story about creating false security to avoid the truth about our human condition, the existential truth of our own ultimate fragility, our own human inability to make ourselves secure on any real level. So, in our fear, we try to fool ourselves with other things. In this case, a bumper crop of produce. In Uncle Scrooge's case, mountains of gold coins. You know, we all know, every one of us know, in our own way, that dread that the rich landowner was trying to hide from. We all know that truth that Uncle Scrooge was trying to avoid in his glittering swimming hole. Maybe it's, 3 o'clock in the morning? And you wake up and you would sell your soul to get back to sleep. And as you lie there, one by one, all the old boogeymen creep out from under the bed. That lump you discovered in your breast last week that you're afraid to mention to anyone. That granddaughter of yours that seems to be running with the wrong crowd and whose values just completely baffle you. That mortgage payment coming up in a week that you don't know how you'll meet. Your mother, who seems to be becoming more and more vague and forgetful. The fact that it's, for some of us, getting harder and harder to get down the stairs with your trick knee and your aching feet. It's hard. It's really hard to face our dependency on things that all ultimately are completely outside of our control. So we try to fool ourselves that we're in charge by trying to create a sense of security, all the time knowing we're ultimately fooling ourselves. That was the real deeper problem of the landowner in Jesus' story. He tried to make and hold on to a security, a comparatively safe place which does not exist. And when that bus smacked into him as he crossed the safe, familiar, well-lighted road one night, he experienced what he secretly knew all along. There is no real security. That no matter how hard we try, there's no wall we can build that will keep those things out. It occurred to me once again in the last couple of weeks that even in the church, in our faith life, in our communal life, we too often do the same thing as well. We often try in churches to cling to a false security. In our fear, as the church around us shrinks and seems maybe to be disappearing, we sometimes scramble to hold tight to old rules, old ways of being that might seem safe because they're old and familiar, even as we know that the old familiar ways we clutch to ourselves are increasingly irrelevant to the world in which we live. I was reminded of that in the last few weeks. So Luke, in this gospel lesson, is great at presenting the problem that confronts all of us. We are fragile people with little control over what happens to us. He presents the problem, but it's only if we read on in the same gospel that we begin to get a glimpse of where our answer lies. And he moves into the lilies of the field story and the birds of the air story. It's only as we read on that we begin to get a glimpse of maybe there is an answer to this problem. After presenting this incident, again, that we don't have any control, despite how we try to ignore that fact and build flimsy walls, hoping to keep the fear at bay, Jesus goes on to present the only possible solution there is. And that's simply learning together to trust the presence with us of the God within whom we live and move and have our being, the God that we swim through, the God that surrounds us and is in us and we are in. The only answer to that awful sense of anxious fragility that we all carry is learning to recognize that we're not alone with it. There's no situation in our lives which we do face alone. The only real security we can ever know is to learn to see, to trust that connection that God is constantly offering us, connection to God Himself and to each other in God. We know in our heart of hearts that all those things we have made to keep the anxiety at bay is really ultimately just as fragile as we are. It's learning to recognize the truth, to see it with our hearts, that God, as promised, is truly with us through it all, holding us in His love. In our baptism, we acknowledge a truth that is always there. Our baptism doesn't make it happen. Our baptism calls us to acknowledge publicly that it's there and accept it, and with grace grow into it more deeply as we grow through life. That we're not alone, which is the most important truth of our lives. That God holds us and will not let us go. And that's why we come here. That's why we come here week after week, year after year. I am very sure that you have, as I do, friends or family members who wonder why we do this. Like, why do we do this? It's odd if you really think about it. They wonder, why do we do this every week? Why do we gather together and do what we do? Well, there are lots of reasons, I'm sure, but one answer is that we do this thing to practice, to rehearse together this thing we believe. Together we go over the truths we hold. We practice them, we remember them, we remind each other of them. At the Eucharistic table, we remind ourselves and each other what we forgot or what we might forget. And we all do forget at times. We do this to remind ourselves and one another that we don't need to be afraid. We don't hold that this will prevent the accidents and the hardships of life, but we do it to remind ourselves of who we are and who God is, so that we can maybe recognize and remember that reality when the knock comes at our door or the door of those we love. We do it so that we can learn the lovely task of holding each other in love as we face whatever life brings us. We do this so that we won't forget that each of us and all of us are loved and held in a love that is closer to us than our lover's kiss. And as we grow into knowing and remembering that, we learn together that we don't need to be afraid. We will be, but we don't need to be. As Jesus says a few short verses after today's reading, do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you everything, the kingdom. So, here we are, friends, rehearsing a truth we sometimes barely remember, rehearsing and practicing a truth we know in our hearts is true. Know that God is here as well, holding you and will never leave you, whatever you're going through at this moment in your life. Be not afraid. And you know, that's better than anything we can invent in its place, including a swimming pool filled with gold coins. Amen.